have soon-to-be Dr. Antonya Gonzalez. She is an assistant professor at Western Washington University. Before she was there, she was doing graduate school at UBC, and we were very excited to hear her talk about the origins of inequity perpetuation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. This is some very new data. I'm really excited to present it today and get some feedback from this group. I'm just going to start off by saying that I have some multinomial logistic regression analyses in here. I'm a student of this analysis, so if anyone has ideas for additional analyses I could conduct or like more intuitive ways to present the data, please tell me. Please just come talk to me after. I'm happy to hear ideas. So I'm going to start by introducing you to two different women. So this is Abigail, and this is Amy. And both of them are women in their early 30s who work for a business firm. And so Abigail is a business executive and has a higher position in the company than Amy does. And Amy manages accounts. So as such, Abigail makes 3 times as much money per year as Amy does. Furthermore, she owns a beautiful apartment overlooking the water in a very wealthy neighborhood, while Amy continues to rent an apartment in a perfectly nice middle-class neighborhood. So arguably, while both of these women have comfortable lives, Abigail is clearly higher status than Amy in terms of her position at work and her material wealth. So why do we think that Abigail has higher status than Amy in these terms? So when we decide to make this kind of judgment, we can call this a status attribution, right? We can come up with a number of different explanations for why Abigail and Amy might be differing in status. So maybe we think that Abigail has higher status because she grew up in a wealthy family, they sent her to an elite university, and that kind of facilitated her ability to get a really good job. Meanwhile, maybe Amy had to pay her own way, spent many years paying off student debt. This would be an external attribution, right? We're saying that there are more structural determinants of this difference in status. We could also say that we think Abigail is more business savvy and intelligent than Amy. So this would be an ability-based attribution. We're saying that they have differences in skills. Or we might think that maybe Abigail has worked very hard for many years to achieve her position, while maybe Amy hasn't worked quite as hard. And this would be an effort-based attribution. And so adult research indicates that, at least in North America, effort-based attributions are a very common type of status attribution. So people often tend to attribute wealth and status to an individual's effort. But in reality, we know that wealth is determined by a number of different factors, right? It's not just one particular thing, and a lot of these factors can be outside of someone's control. And when we ignore external factors and we focus only on effort, we may place undue responsibility on disadvantaged individuals for their own economic situation. And this appears to be the case, and research with adults shows that effort-based attributions are linked to behavioral outcomes in adults. So for example, when adults assume that someone's status is a product of effort, this leads to higher tolerance for inequality and defense of the status quo. In contrast, when external attributions are made for status, people show more support for economic redistribution and policies that support reducing inequality. So further evidence that effort-based attributions can affect behavior comes from children. So a very recent study with 9 through 11-year-old children indicates that these effort-based status attributions can lead to less generosity towards the target of that attribution. So children who had been explicitly taught that effort leads to success and wealth were compared with a control group who was not taught this. And so researchers found that while the students who were taught about effort were equally likely to give to an unlucky recipient, they were far less likely to give to someone who they believed had failed at an effort-based task. And this was in comparison to the control group. And so taken together, evidence suggests that attributing an individual's lack of success or wealth to effort might potentially result in behaviors that perpetuate inequality as early as childhood. But this is very much preliminary evidence, and we don't know too much about really the prevalence or predictors of these different status attributions in childhood. So in order to explore origins of these attributions, the current study examined effort-based attributions in children ages 11 through 14 and their parents. And specifically, the vast majority of families from this sample fell into the upper 2 quintiles of income in Canada, with a mean income of over $100,000 a year. And so wealthy families provide an important case study here, because statistics published in the past decade suggest that the top 2 quintiles in Canada control the vast majority of the wealth in the country. And so these families are more likely to have supplemental income that they may consider redistributing through mediums like charitable giving or even potentially through voting behaviors. And so as such, it's important to understand the effort-based attributions that might affect the generosity and behavior of these families that control a vast majority of the wealth. And so in the study, as mentioned before, we specifically chose to examine the prevalence and predictors of these attributions in children. So while we don't know too much about how often effort-based attributions are used in comparison to other types of attributions, it's plausible that at least in North America, children may tend to use these effort-based attributions due to the prominence of meritocracy as a cultural ideology. So research suggests that many children as young as age 10 have internalized what's called the Protestant work ethic. And so this is a lay theory that hard work leads to success. So other people might call this like the American dream, right? That idea. And so this ideology may be particularly prominent in advantaged individuals who want to attribute their own success to hard work. And so we predicted that in our sample, which was quite wealthy, children and their parents would tend to use effort-based attributions more often than other types of status attributions. We also anticipated that, like many forms of bias, so for example, race bias, gender stereotypes, parents' bias might actually predict that of their children's. So even though we don't directly test this in the current study, we thought that parents could be transmitting beliefs about status and effort to their children. And so our second hypothesis was that wealthy parents' patterns of status attribution would predict their children's patterns. And so if parents were more likely to explain status using effort-based attributions, then their children would as well, and this would be the same for external attributions. And so we based our status attribution measure off of one developed by Husick and Symbian that has been used with very young children and adults across a wide age range. And so we adapted this method, and participants were presented with a status disparity between 2 groups of people on a faraway planet. So for example, the Blarks and the Orps. And so they were then presented with potential explanations for the disparity. And so one explanation was based on effort. So maybe the Blarks have more money than the Orps because they work harder at their jobs. Another was based off ability. So maybe the Blarks have more money than the Orps because they're naturally smarter. And then finally, an external attribution was provided. So maybe the Blarks have more money than the Orps because they found gold a long time ago. And so for every disparity, they heard about 4 different types of disparities. So a wealth disparity, an academic disparity, an occupation hierarchy disparity, so saying one person was the boss and another person worked below them in the company, and then an occupation status disparity, so just based off of what job they were in. And so for every disparity, their choices fell into one of these 3 options. And so our primary interest was really in the wealth question, but we also wanted to look at these different types of status attributions to see whether choices might vary based on the marker of status that's used. And so parents and their children both completed these measures. And so this graph shows the response frequency across questions for children. And so the distribution is significantly different from chance, with children generally choosing an effort-based explanation on 75% of responses. And this pattern held for all 4 questions except for question 3, which was about the job hierarchy, so asking why one individual was a boss, or why one group tended to be the bosses while the other group didn't. And so on this question, children were equally likely to make an ability judgment and an effort judgment. And so for parents, there was more variation for the job-related questions. So the distributions were different from chance, but for the financial and academic questions, parents were still choosing to select more effort-based attributions, though there's certainly more variability for the wealth question. Whereas for the job hierarchy question, adults were more likely to attribute a higher job position to ability. And then for job status, they were more likely to attribute differences to external attributes. And so these results suggest that children and their parents were attributing wealth and academic success to effort. And so this could be, and in contrast, the attributions about job hierarchy and job status were a bit less clear. And this could be a result of children being less familiar with kind of what's required to be in a job position, whereas adults kind of have a better sense of what that actually means. And so they might not be quite as susceptible to these effort-based attributions in childhood or even in adulthood. And so, but this variability in responses suggests that adults and children might have different patterns of attributions. And so some parents and children may be more likely to make a certain type of attribution across the board. And so we decided to see whether parent bias to select one type of attribution over another would predict their children's. And so we conducted a multinomial logistic regression looking at whether parent status attributions were predictive of their children. So we controlled for household income, parent and child gender, parent and child age. And so we looked at the relative risk ratios, so essentially similar to odd ratios, which tell us the likelihood of a child making one attribution relative to another compared to when their parents make that same choice. So basically, does a parent's pattern of responses predict their children making that same response? And so I'm presenting this as a bar graph as for simplicity of interpretation. But again, if somebody has a better idea, please talk to me after. So basically, these are the relative risk ratios. So we found that when parents were more likely to choose an external attribution over an ability-based attribution, children were 3.96 times more likely to also choose an external attribution over an ability attribution. When parents were more likely to choose an effort-based attribution over an external attribution, children were 2.55 times more likely to also make that same choice pattern. And then finally, when parents were more likely to choose an effort attribution over an ability attribution, children were 2.78 times more likely to make that same choice. So essentially, for all of these different choice patterns, children's choices reflected their parents. So this was a significant predictor in all three pattern options. And so, taken together, we can make some preliminary conclusions from this work. So, at least in the domains of wealth and academics, wealthy children and their parents tend to make more effort-based attributions for success. Right? And this makes sense in the domain of wealth, particularly given the cultural emphasis on meritocracy, as well as the socioeconomic status of these families. And furthermore, the academic effort-based attributions may actually be due to recent cultural push for growth mindsets within education. So we're more concerned with the wealth finding in terms of being a concerning finding, as this has the potential to affect outcomes such as charitable giving, voting decisions about economic redistribution, and other behaviors that may perpetuate or reduce inequality. And so this work is suggesting that as early as age 11, wealthy children might start to have this bias. And so this finding highlights the importance of better understanding how and why a bias to make effort-based attributions might emerge later in childhood. And so we also found that parent patterns were predicting their children's attribution patterns, which suggests that parents may be transmitting their attribution patterns to their children. But alternatively, this could just be heavily influenced by culture. So maybe if they're both kind of in the same area, they're receiving the same cultural messages, maybe this is kind of like a third variable. But future work should seek to examine whether or not there are certain parental behaviors or conversations that might encourage or discourage effort-based attributions in the domain of wealth. So for parents and children who are more likely to make external attributions in the domain of wealth, what are the conversations that they're having? And of course, there are some key limitations to this work. So one of them is that we did not use like a free response measure. We gave them choices. So that might kind of constrain the possibilities for what types of attributions could be made. Another limitation is that it's like a small sample of a relatively small sample of early adolescence, right? And so this doesn't really tell us much about earlier development or when these attribution patterns are starting to emerge. So currently in a follow-up study, we're trying to replicate these results in children ages 7 through 10. And we also don't really know much about the predictive validity of this measure, right? So we're kind of just assuming that this measure, that these effort-based attributions will lead to behavioral consequences based on work with adults. But we need to look directly to see actually do these attributions predict behavior. And so we have a follow-up study in the process looking at the behavioral consequences of making these effort-based wealth attributions. And so ultimately, my goal and the goal for this line of research, which again, this is like some very new data, very excited to get feedback, but the ultimate goal will be to develop interventions that kind of target these wealth attributions, and by maybe reducing the prevalence of effort-based attributions, reducing some of these behaviors that perpetuate inequality. And so thank you to my collaborators, and thank you to everyone for listening.
We have time for 2 questions. 1 or 2 questions?
Yes.
It's really interesting stuff. You mentioned growth mindset, and I was wondering, you're right, there is a big emphasis on that. And I just think about my kids when they're in elementary school, there's signs all over about growth mindset. They're taught to say, I don't know things yet. And I'm just wondering, are you measuring that in your follow-up studies, or do you think those co-emerge in development, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm actually really curious about whether or not those growth mindsets that have been shown to be really helpful in academics actually might transfer over to wealth attributions and then be potentially harmful. I think in follow-up studies that's something really interesting to look at. But yeah, I mean, there could certainly be a connection there. But I think the approach, this is speculating way far in the future, but I think that ultimately the approach would probably be to figure out a way to kind of emphasize a growth mindset in academics without bringing that over to kind of the wealth domain. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm not that surprised that the kids in your sample, effort, because it's a high income, high education sample. And probably a lot of parents are saying these things to their kids, like not considering the potential downstream effects of saying those kinds of things. Because you don't want to say to your kid like, well, you'll get rich because I'm rich, so yeah. So clearly there can be like non-nefarious reasons why you might coach your kids about the role of effort and success, that then might have all these bad downstream consequences. I totally see what you're saying, and I'm just curious, like, do you have plans to study this in a non-wealthy sample?
Yeah.
To see whether the kids have different attributions, because I think if they do versus don't, that'll point you in different directions for like what you should then do next, right, in terms of the goals of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is some work that isn't like exactly this, but there is some work with kids suggesting that adolescents from lower SES families do tend to make more external attributions when they're kind of just like interviewed about these economic situations. So I would suspect, that we might get something very different if we change our sample. Yeah, and I feel like, we have to do a lot more because this work is very much like kind of like taking a snapshot of one group. We have to see like how much this generalizes and then look at some of those differences. But yes, I would suspect that it's probably different.
Is it answered?
Yeah, we have that.
So I think it's super interesting when you mentioned that you're not really sure, you can't tease apart whether or not it's the parents' influence or if it's just a societal influence. So I was wondering if you would be able to do some sort of analysis on if the parents were first or second generation rich, because you can imagine if they actually work from the bottom and now they're here, they would be more likely to perpetuate effort based to their children and like drill that in their heads, whereas if they kind of just got wealth well, from their parents, then they might feel a little guilty about perpetuating effort-based.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I haven't considered that, but that could be a really cool measure to throw in to kind of see what parents say about how they've acquired their own wealth. I think we might actually have that in the current study, that were the follow-up study, so, but if not, I'll get back to you hopefully.